Tamamdır. YouTube yayını da açtık. Hatta tweet de attım. Senin arkadaşına da gönderdim. Oradan takip edecekmiş. Evet, bizim arkadaşının sesi buradan geldi. Şimdi bir dakika. Bir daha yeni gelenler de var. Onları da alalım. Evet. Şu an seni artık introduce edebilirim aslında. Bugünkü konuğumuz Türkiye Uzaktan İktisat Seminerlerinde Bilge Erten. Pınar Keskin'le ortak çalışmasını sunacak Wellesley College'den ki Bilge Erten de Northeastern Üniversitesi'nde ve İZA ile affiliate durumda. Makalenin başlığı Trade-offs, The Impact of WTO Accession on Intimate Partner Violence in Cambodia. Söz senin sevgili Bilge.
Çok teşekkür ederim sevgili Ceyhun. Gerçekten çok büyük bir onur ve çok memnun oldum buradaki seminer grubuna katılmak için. Ben de organize ettiğiniz seminerleri vaktim olduğunca dinlemeye çalışıyorum. Yani bir takım belki İngilizce konuşan insan gelebileceğini düşünerek İngilizce sunacağım sunumu ama kendimden birazcık kısaca bahsetmek gerekirse Northeastern Üniversitesi'ndeyim, Boston'da çalışıyorum. 6 senedir çalışıyorum, yardımcı doçentim ve genelde çalışma alanlarım kalkınma iktisatı, cinsiyet eşitsizliği, uluslararası iktisat. Bu konular üzerine çalışıyorum ve bu çalışmada spesifik olarak yani trade liberalizasyonunun aile içi şiddete etkisine baktık. Özellikle de partnerler arasındaki şiddete baktık. Kamboçya kontekstinde daha detaylı anlatacağım ama yani eğer paper'la ilgilenirseniz web sitemde var www.bilgeerten.com sitesinden full paper'a ulaşabilirsiniz. Ayrıca seminer sonrasında ek sorularınız cevaplayamadığım sorularınız olursa lütfen e-mail ile bana atın ve cevap vermeye çalışacağım. Şimdi I guess we can start. The title of the paper is Trade-offs, the Impact of WTO Accession on Intimate Partner Violence in Cambodia. It's a new working paper, so comments are all welcome. We know that, let me motivate this by saying that there has been very rapid episodes of trade liberalization across the developing world in the recent decades. And this has been a major topic of interest, both in development economics, but also international economics broadly. So when we think about the literature, various papers have shown that when countries open up to international trade in the form of cutting import tariffs, the increased import competition that results from, having more imported goods coming into the domestic market and competing with the domestic goods tends to increase this competition in the domestic markets, and to the extent that foreign producers have, some kind of competitive advantage, that can push the domestic producers out of the market. And there's a lot of evidence that because of these competitive pressure, in general, the local labor markets that are more exposed to this import competition tend to experience losses in employment or shifts in employment out of the sectors in which the competition is more intense towards the sectors in which there's not much competition. For example, many studies show that manufacturing employment decline, and then people might shift into services or informal type employment. So, Paunik has a really good paper that summarizes all of this literature. And Dix Carnegie and Kovac has a number of papers in the context of Brazil that has shown these effects, in particular showing that workers tend to move out of formal sectors into informal sector. I have a paper where we looked at the similar shock import competition in South Africa, but we found that formal employment declines, but because informal sector is very small, workers tend to shift into non-employment or unemployment. So there's not much of evidence of a shift into informal sector. So in this paper, we are sort of interested in a little bit of a different question, shifting our focus not just on the labor market, but sort of thinking about how these labor market changes can have effects on men and women differentially. And through these differential effects, how does that affect intimate partner violence. And partly our interest has stemmed from the fact that there's been a number of papers that looked at violence more broadly in the form of criminal, like violent episodes. In particular, Melissa Dahl has a paper where she shows that in Mexico, exposure to trade competition tends to reduce the opportunity cost of criminal employment, and through that has increased violent crime in Mexico. And Rafael has a paper that shows that public goods provision tends to also decline as states' revenues decline in the local government context when labor markets suffer, and that has also consequences for inequality. And through these channels, crime overall tends to go up in regions that are more adversely affected by the trade shock. Now, when you look at the gender aspect, there are also papers that have shown that these trade-induced job losses can vary by gender, that in some contexts, man's employment declines a lot more than women's employment, like it was shown by Gaddis and Peters in context of Brazil. In some contexts, like Mexico, it has been shown that sometimes firms upgrade their technologies, and the new technologies can be much more female-friendly, but through computerization. And so it can actually lead to replacement of male workers by female workers. So in this study, essentially, we're going to look at these, how trade-induced employment changes in Cambodia has an effect on intimate partner violence. And this is a question that has not been studied much. To the extent that, as far as I know, this is the first paper that tries to show some causal evidence on this effect. We are going to follow the trade literature, and we're going to look at sort of these regional variation across different regions of Cambodia about how international competition shocks varied across regions, looking at Cambodia's entry into World Trade Organization. And we're going to essentially identify some labor demand shocks that were affecting these regions differentially due to the initial specialization across regions in the country. And because some products' tariffs were cut more than others, these initial specialization played an important role in determining which regions were more negatively affected compared to other regions that were less negatively affected. So I'm going to talk about essentially how these trade liberalization has these differential effects across regions, and thinking about these differential effects, how does that affect men's and women's employment differently, or does it affect, we're going to test that, and then does it affect earnings outcomes as well. And from this channel, we are going to think about how does it affect intimate partner violence if these differences are changing due to the trade shock. So we know that domestic violence or intimate partner violence in general is an important social, economic, and public health problem. And in particular, there's a large literature that has shown that women in violent relationships generally report greater mental health problems. They tend to suffer from generally, bigger health issues, like also, things like sexually transmitted diseases, unintended pregnancies, but just in general, also more alcohol abuse and substance abuse. And also because they suffer from essentially this kind of a productivity shock, they're more absent from work. So this has then also effects, of course, in their ability to contribute to the household income and their bargaining power within the household. So this paper by Campbell is mostly like correlational evidence, but the second set of papers that I listed here, for example, by Iser, it's quasi-experimental evidence that shows that children born and raised in such violent households are more likely to have lower birth rates. and they have more difficulty in relating with their peers, right? This is the paper by Carlson. And also there's some evidence that there's delays in neurocognitive development, and these children might have lower IQ as well. So it's a range of developmental outcomes that end up suffering as a result of exposure to violence within the household. And so these intergenerational effects are also very important. And it's another reason why there has been now increasing research in this area. And these children may also impose negative spillover effects on their peers, right? So there's also, this is a quasi-experimental study that shows that if your child is in a classroom with another child whose parents had intimate partner violence, in that case, the developmental problems occurring in this child also has externalities, negative externalities on other children in this classroom. So, which is also quite important and interesting, showing us that it's not just actually limited to the families that suffer from this problem, but the negative effects actually spill over to other families as well. Now, when we think about these trade-induced employment shocks and how they can affect intimate partner violence, one thing we should think about is that there is going to be these differences in employment effects. We don't know a priori what will be the differences. But in general, we know that if there is economic empowerment of women, let's say that as a result of trade shocks, somehow women have increased employment opportunities. In that case, we know that that can be sometimes thought as an important tool against fighting intimate partner violence. But we should be careful here because, in fact, neither the empowerment of women nor in general the effects of these trade-induced employment changes can be thought of having very clear-cut effects on intimate partner violence. And in fact, these effects are a priori ambiguous. So on the one hand, we have bargaining theories that generally predict that if there is a narrowing of the gender employment gap, so in which case, for example, we know that in general, men work more than women in almost in most contexts. So if there is a narrowing of that gender employment gap in which women's employment increases relative to men's, or that they both decline, but the man's employment declines more than the women's employment, in that case, the relative improvement in women's employment prospects can actually increase the woman's bargaining power within the household and increase her outside option. And therefore, because of this, credible exit option, women might actually have a greater ability to not tolerate domestic violence, and this can reduce their exposure to domestic violence due to this improvement in their bargaining power within the household. And Iser has a paper that shows that when the gender wage gaps are reduced due to these differential labor demand shocks across regions of California, that actually reduced the reduction of gender wage gaps, reduced intimate partner violence by essentially increasing the bargaining power of women. Another paper by Anderbeck has shown that for the context of UK, similar dynamics occur, but looking at unemployment shocks. But this is not the whole story. And in fact, in developing countries in particular, there's a lot of evidence that a second channel can be at play. And this is what we can generally call like a backlash channel or instrumental violence theories. And here, what might happen is that a reduction in the gender employment gap can actually increase the male partner's incentives to use violence or just the threats of violence as an instrument to regain control over household decision-making, right? Because now that women are more powerful, they might have a greater say on certain things within the household, and this might feel threatening for men. So they might use violence to regain household decision-making power. But in addition, if women have additional financial resources, violence can be a tool of extraction to receive some of these additional earnings. Or it's possible that violence can be a tool for control over how women's time is allocated. In particular, you can use violence to coerce women to work additional hours in unpaid work as well, in the family farm, for example. And there's some evidence of this, across countries. In Mexico, for example, by Bobonis, we have a number of papers in the context of Turkey, where we found some evidence of this. For example, we have shown that in response to the exogenous education shock in Turkey, where women received increased education, we have found that they have worked a lot. They started to work more in the service sector, their earnings improved. And as a result, though, that we found that they were more exposed to both psychological violence and financial control by their male partners. In a subsequent paper, we looked at the Syrian refugee shock. We showed that women's employment declined as a response to the Syrian inflows, as there was a greater displacement of Turkish women by Syrians. But we found that as a result of this decline in female employment and not that much change in men's employment, that violence declined. And again, this has to be the case, that the initial violence had to do with some kind of extraction motive coming from women's employment. So in other words, these two theories, they're competing. So in the bargaining theory context, most papers that I know of that have shown these effects are from advanced countries. And in the instrumental violence theories, most papers I know of are from India, from Mexico, from other developing countries, also like the Turkish context. But still, we don't know. And the Cambodia, even though we know it's a very low-income country, we cannot still say that which one of these theories is going to dominate. It's an empirical question. And I should also say, I talked about like the narrowing of the gender employment gap, but it's also possible trade shocks can also widen the gender employment gap. It's not also clear, in which case we can we might see opposite effects, again working through the same two channels that I've talked about. So if I want to preview our results, so we can say that in general, we find that men in districts that experienced larger tariff reductions had experienced a significant decline in employment. Okay, whereas for women that were in harder hit districts, there was an increasing entry into the workforce. And so these essentially, and these differences are extremely significant when we test the two. We can show that there is a decline in men's employment, but women increase their entry. And I'm going to show more of that, but essentially women enter into employment in the agricultural sectors to compensate for some of the loss in household income. So that's where the most of this increase comes from. But what we find also is that this increase in women's employment ends up triggering some backlash effects, and it ends up increasing intimate partner violence. I'm going to show across a number of dimensions, in particular several dimensions of physical violence, sexual violence, and some control over women's decision-making power. When we explore alternative channels, we find no evidence of significant changes in marriage rates, fertility, psychological distress. Okan had a question. Do you think that these two competing theories may also imply a non-linear relationship between women, income, employment, and violence? Sure. I think the jury is out on that. I don't think that most papers looked at the non-linearity. It's possible that, you might have a certain relationship and then there might be thresholds after which the relationship might also change. I think we don't have much evidence of that, but I think certainly that can happen. And we can discuss more of it maybe towards the end. And so the evidence that we find in general is essentially consistent with instrumental theories of violence, right? So in this particular case, so we find that these trade-induced changes in labor market conditions strengthen incentives of women to use violence or other controlling behavior as an instrument for extracting resources from women. In this particular context, this is essentially extraction in the form of female working hours. Like essentially, more women are made to work more in the unpaid sector in this particular context. Okay, so when we think about the background, let me give you a little bit of background how this trade liberalization happened. So Cambodia gained independence from France in 1953, and it essentially had a program focusing on building the industrial base and sort of investing in infrastructure projects, building factories. And there was a brief experimentation with tariff liberalization, but this was very unsuccessful. Many small and medium-sized firms did not survive this shock. And this was completely reversed when the famous Khmer, or the infamous, I should call, Khmer Rouge regime came to power in 1975. So they essentially defined themselves with a Maoist ideology, and they shut down all international trade flows, with the exception of some allied communist countries. And this is the time period when the country enters into a deep civil war. It's one of the most violent civil wars in the world. And after the war, essentially the new government comes to power with the goal of eradicating hunger, because it was extremely devastating for society, economy overall. Now, as an early attempt, the state monopoly on foreign trade was abolished in 1987. So there was sort of more increased engagement of firms with trade at that point. And then in 1993, the current Kingdom of Cambodia was established, and they had a clear goal of industrial development by engaging with international trade. And finally, in 2004, which is the time period we're most interested in, Cambodia becomes the first least developed country to join World Trade Organization together with Nepal. Now, as a result of this commitment to WTO, Cambodia has a rapid tariff cut to liberalize its trade with the rest of the world. And here is a graph that shows you this rapid tariff cut. So this is the unweighted average tariffs. You can see from 2001, which is the earliest date we have on tariffs data. You can see it's almost coming from 18% to about 8%. So it's roughly 10 percentage point decline. And most of the decline you see actually happens quite early on in the first 4 years, but there's a little bit towards the end as well. So, one thing that's really important in this situation is how exogenous these tariff changes are to the industry performance. In particular, one concern is that maybe policymakers were imposing smaller tariff cuts for sort of better performing industries that lobby for such policies, right? If there's a strong lobby in a certain industry, and if maybe that industry is also sensitive in terms of hiring a lot of workers, then maybe the policymakers cut tariffs less for those groups. And then, we wouldn't talk about exogeneity in this context. Now, I'm going to argue that in this context of Cambodia's trade liberalization, these threats for identification are limited for a number of reasons. Okay, so one is that if you look at the descriptive evidence on this, it seems that private sector really played a very small role in affecting how tariff changes were determined, because the post-conflict government had a very strong role in sort of deriving how the speed of liberalization, the engagement with WTO, and had a clear mandate to demonstrate itself as a liberal, so more open government to access world markets. It was certainly perceived as such. And in addition, the WTO negotiation led to the government committing sort of 4 discrete categories of tariff cuts along these 0, 7, 15, and 35% groups, and excluded this possibility of discretionary changes to the tariff structure, right? So it was harder to tweak any particular tariff rate that the industries could lobby for. These groups had to be sort of more predetermined. Okay, so when you look at tariff changes and pre-liberalization tariff levels, we also see that the industries that initially had very high tariffs, you can see that, for example, towards here, this lower right part, those were the industries that also experienced very sharp tariff cut, right? So, and as you move up, so if you're an industry around here with the medium in the pre-liberalization tariff rate, you also face sort of a medium decline. And so there was sort of a harmonization of tariff rates with the industries initially having the highest tariffs facing the biggest tariff cuts. This also is sort of this really sort of very sharp sort of regression fit with a correlation of 0.91 tells us that essentially there was not a lot of very big outliers. And I'm going to show you some robustness checks in which we excluded some outliers, like for example, furniture seems like a bit of an outlier. We also excluded the highest industries and the lowest industries from our calculation of the local tariff exposure. And actually our results are extremely robust to doing those types of changes. So, but this is generally evidence that's used in the literature to support this argument for exogeneity. So as I wrote here, the industry with highest tariff levels prior to liberalization had the greatest tariff reductions. We are going to also show that districts exposed to different levels of tariff reduction do not demonstrate any differential trends in employment outcomes observed prior to trade liberalization. So I'm going to show you some placebo tests looking at employment. I won't be able to do that for domestic violence because we don't have another, like we have one pre-liberalization domestic violence survey, but we don't have another one. So for domestic violence, I won't be able to show that. So the identification strategy is essentially we have this district level exposure measure for tariff liberalizations. And we're going to combine essentially this baseline industrial composition with industry level tariff changes over time to create kind of a Bartik type exposure measure. And so this is going to be a difference in differences strategy where we're going to compare essentially districts characterized by sort of different levels of exposure in this period, conditional on this district and year fixed effects, like comparing districts who were more exposed to those that were less exposed, conditional on district and year fixed effects and district specific linear trends. So I think that this is quite important, the district specific linear trends, because it's going to absorb, for example, differential trajectories in which districts were facing before the liberalization. And so it's going to hopefully absorb some of that unobserved heterogeneity. We are going to also control for time varying individual characteristics. So the tariff measure essentially is going to be, so 1998, so pre-trade liberalization, employment shares defined at the industry I in district D. And we're going to create a weighted average using these employment shares, looking at tariffs changing at industry I at time period T. So essentially this variation, the initial industrial composition is going to drive how how much a district is exposed to these differential tariff changes that I showed you like across this diagram. And so this will be our main source of variation, this district tariff. Okay, and the primary specification, as I said already, is going to essentially regress this district tariff on outcomes. These outcomes, they're defined at individual level. And we're going to think about essentially controlling for individual characteristics, the year fixed effects, the district fixed effects. District fixed effects will absorb, time invariant characteristics. The year fixed effect absorbs macro shocks. And this district specific trends is essentially going to absorb like these differential trajectories that districts could be facing pre-trade liberalization. So I think it's really important to control for that. So we will estimate this with OLS clustering standard errors at the district level. So for this project, we mobilized several sources of data, in particular the census data, the DHS, demographic and health surveys for 3 waves. We had the socioeconomic surveys, 4 waves of that. And we collected tariff data from the World Bank's database. So for domestic violence indices, so most papers in the recent literature, they've been using these Z-scores, which are essentially, compiling different indicators, like things like, for example, slap, push, hit, etc., standardizing them and then taking an average. And doing that essentially creates more statistical power to identify effects that work in the same direction for a group of indicators. And we have been mostly doing that in our other papers as well. These are, I think, the one different thing we have here is the injury index, which we capture as like bruises, light injuries, and severe injuries due to violent acts by one's partner. So the Cambodian, the domestic violence data gives us information about essentially whether the violent episode resulted in one of these types of injuries. And we create an index of that to create sort of a more objective measure of violence. But obviously these are all self-reported. How many districts? Sorry, we have 160 districts. And we also have 40 industries. Yeah, good question. Thank you, Orkun. So, I think we have enough districts to catch some quite micro level variation. Okay, let me see. Yeah, so higher index values will give essentially higher levels of intimate partner violence according to these definitions. The summary statistics, so we have essentially, looking at census data, demographic characteristics, you can see that this is a low educated population, like average years of schooling is about 5. For men and lower for women. And in general, men tend to be sort of more educated. Most of population lives in rural areas. You can see that 80%, and there's high employment rates because there's very high agricultural employment. So agricultural employment rate, it is about 60% in our sample. And when you look at sort of these different categories, so there is sort of this paid employment is about 16%. And there's very high self-employment, 45%, most of which is in agriculture. So this man, but also for women, you can see similar statistics, but for women, you can see that unpaid employment is higher because most women work as unpaid workers within the family farm. Okay. And in terms of the DHS sample, so one limitation we have here in the DHS sample is that we actually don't observe men's employment, but we have women's employment. For men, we only observe occupation. Unfortunately, we could not necessarily, deduce whether they work or not from occupation. we have these, indices. So indices don't tell you much about the prevalence of violence in Cambodia. Roughly, it's 25% risk of intimate partner violence within a woman's lifetime. So fairly high. In terms of yearly variation, it's about 10% chance of facing physical or sexual violence. Talk a little bit. So, these high marriage rates, and we're going to look at number of children and so on. We're going to look at some indicators for husband's jealousy and so on. We'll talk more about that later. So when we look at labor market outcomes, one thing I didn't tell you in the specification is that we need to interpret these coefficients sort of in the sense that in districts that face a larger decline, for example, if there's a positive coefficient, that means that men also face a greater decline. So negative is a positive coefficient. So essentially, in districts where men experience, in a district that faced a larger tariff decline, men were more likely to lose their employment, and they were more likely to transition out of the workforce. This is not in the labor force. There's a little bit of increase in unemployment, not significant. For women, there is a greater employment if in districts that faced a bigger shock. And most of these women actually previously were not working. So there's a decline in not being in the labor force. There's an increase in looking for a job in unemployment, and there's a large increase in working now. And you can see that these are all significantly different across men and women. For labor market outcomes, when we look at sort of more across type and sector, we can see that this is for men. There was a large decline in paid employment. You can see that this was across various sectors. So manufacturing definitely, but also services. So in districts where manufacturing experienced a decline, services also experienced a decline. But this is all paid employment. And what you see is that essentially people losing more formal jobs and switching into more informal type jobs. You can see that men switched into informal employment. You see these are unpaid employment going up, and also self-employment going up. But in total, when you look at all of these categories, there's a decline. And for women, what we observe is that they also actually experience losses in formal employment. And switching into informal employment, we see a big increase in unpaid employment and a little bit in self-employment. And you can see that like a very big chunk of this is coming from agriculture. So we see that essentially women increase their sort of work in the family farm, in other unpaid family enterprises in order to compensate for the losses in household income. And this is related to the added worker effect known in the labor literature. So I won't show you the earnings, but maybe let me quickly show. So for earnings, so we see that men's earnings declines, women's earnings declines as well. But when we look at the imputed wages, there's not much change in women's earnings, but men's earnings still decline. And always, whether you look at it in sort of percentage point terms or percent terms, the men's earnings decline more than women's earnings. Okay, for intimate partner violence, so this is the DHS sample. Again, women's employment. This is for the whole DHS sample. There's an increase in women's employment. This is our domestic violence module, the smaller 8,000 observations. You see again, increase in women's employment and across physical violence, injuries, sexual violence, we see significant increases in these dimensions. We don't find a significant increase in psychological violence. For decision-making, we see a decline. So essentially women work more, but they actually lose decision-making power. They also face more violence within the household. And thinking about these two dynamics, we think that this is more in line with the instrumental theories of violence, where there's an increased incentive for men to try to control women's work in this context. So let me talk a little bit more about alternative channels, and I will come back to the interpretation again. So, you know, what about changes in other marriage market outcomes? Well, we don't see any changes in women's marital status. So there's a paper by Otterdorn and Hansen. They actually show that like in response to trade shock in the US, like marriage rates, for example, declined in the US. But we don't see that in Cambodia. And we also don't see much changes in fertility. We also don't see significant changes in psychological problems, right? So one counter hypothesis is that maybe, you know, women, could it be that men became more upset when they lost their jobs, and as a result, this upset triggered more violence? To the extent we can measure, we don't see that. For husband's behavior, you know, you could also argue maybe now that women work more, husband is more jealous, and that can trigger violence. And actually, we don't find much evidence of that either. Another alternative channel could be that, you know, because women were at a very young age when the initial liberalization started, it could be that their schooling changed because maybe the parents could not send them to school as much as they would have. Actually, we don't find much evidence of that alternative channel either. Okay, so there's a question. For family enterprise, do we mean employed in their partner's business or their partner's relative's business? Is it possible to distinguish? So they're mostly employed in their own partner's business. So in the data, yeah, it's true. We don't have really information on the ownership per se, but most of these are, yeah, it's possible that, you know, de facto the older male, like let's say the husband's father might own the farm, but then still the adult husband generally controls like the financial decisions within the household. Yeah. The placebo test, so when we look at sort of the pre-accession period, so we don't see much changes in the employment outcomes, and we see that these changes appear in the post-accession period. For additional checks, so we did look at migration. For example, we looked at whether the district population changes, looking at census data. We didn't find that. We also looked at DHS data, whether the husband has increasing probability of living away. Maybe he cannot find a job, he moves to a different district. And actually we don't find evidence of that either. And then as I was telling you earlier, we looked at some robustness checks, like looking at the log of district tariff. For, that's, you know, just very minor, but we looked at, for example, excluding industries with highest tariff declines or industries with the lowest tariff declines, right? Maybe these are driving the results, and actually we don't find that. We also excluded like these off-diagonal, like I showed you furniture, for example, things like that that are not really aligned with that graph, to see maybe there's some lobbying going on in that industry. And actually we didn't find that either. So to conclude, we think that this might be the first evidence on the effects of trade liberalization on intimate partner violence. And in this context, the trade liberalization had a negative effect on employment of women in districts that face relatively bigger shocks compared to districts that face smaller shocks. And in those districts, we see that women increase their entry into the workforce. But these employment changes essentially triggered backlash effects by increasing intimate partner violence. And I showed you the dimensions. We observed that without actually generating changes in other marriage market outcomes or fertility or also psychological distress. And we think that this is consistent with instrumental use of violence by men that aims to gain control of household decision making and also extracting resources from women. And we think that in this particular context, it's more, controlling women's time allocation in, increasing her work in the family enterprise seems to be a major channel. And neglecting these, potentially large backlash effects can actually yield some upward estimates of what is the societal benefit accruing from trade liberalization. So thank you for listening to the presentation. I can maybe look at the comments or we can open it up to discussion. Okay, so there's a question. Let me see. What about the role that violent environmental culture that Khmer Rouge regime created? So that's a good question. So the civil war happened in 1970 and to 1975. It's true, like throughout the 80s, there was a still pretty violent environment. But we can say that starting around 1990s, so Khmer Rouge related, at least violence, has not been, has not really taken place. So it's true, we actually didn't check whether this particular episode also created violence outside of the home. And we could potentially check that. It's the violence data is not as high quality as this particular data that we use, but I think that can certainly be checked. Is there any other questions?
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, Bilge.
Hi, Orkun.
Yeah, sorry. I may have missed. I was on and off working on something else, but maybe you already explained it. So one question was the initial question that I raised on the chat button, which is basically, so when I hear about your two theories, competing theories, one is about bargaining between men and women within the marriage or within the partnership, where men use, for instance, men may feel that their partners may leave them if they have, outside options. And then, when you have those outside options, you have more leverage against your partner. So then, you may have a better treatment from your partner. And then the other theory is more about extraction, where the violence is basically used as an instrument, right? And I'm thinking, I think there has to be some kind of nonlinear relationship here, which is based on the initial conditions of the relationship, in the sense that if you start from a point where the women are earning much less, right, and then they start raising a bit, then you might be able to see. I mean, even though they may not interpret this marginal changes as as increased leverage or outside options, men would probably start using violence as an instrument in those cases. But where if you have good conditions already and your income is increasing even more, and then you obviously have better options outside, and then the other theory may be more applicable. So I was really wondering about this kind of nonlinear effects, whether that could be something that you could look into, and how you may relate that to those theories. And second one is about the results that you're showing about the psychology and fertility. These are all relationship-based variables, and there's not much there as far as I can see, right? And how do you interpret that? Like, how is it affecting the violence but not other variables? Like, what was your take on those? And then and then also on the men's employment. So they are losing jobs, but you're saying that this violence may not have much to do with them losing their jobs because their psychological well-being is not changed, right? Is that your main kind of argument against that, or do you have other things? And I was also thinking maybe conditioning some of these results depending on the loss of employment on the part of the men. So yeah, again, some kind of heterogeneity across regions where men lost the most jobs, and in some place maybe with an interaction or something. that could be helpful. Yeah, sorry if that was too long.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much, Orkun, for these really interesting comments. So I totally agree with you, like that the initial bargaining power of women within the household can be very important in determining, you know, what happens next, like how and the extent to which they are then, you know, affected by the shock. So in this context, I mean, we can definitely tell that in the generalized context of Cambodia, because most women were already, I mean, it's true, some women worked in the textile sector, which had really good wages, and some of those jobs were hit by the shock. And there was this, you know, shift out of those sectors into more working into the sort of agriculture, more informal sector jobs. And what we see then is that essentially they start working more in the sort of unpaid sector. And that part, you know, we were thinking about, you know, does this really, you know, represent empowerment of women? And maybe it does not. So that's the tricky part, because essentially, you know, if we could say that all of these women now increase their employment in like fantastic jobs, and, you know, they make so much more, and that's a different story, like really empowerment of women. But in this context, what we see is something actually quite different, which is that then women end up entering into this agricultural sort of more less job security, really dependent on their spouses. And we see that they, you know, really increase their employment in that margin. And so this sort of tells us that maybe part of the story is that could be, our interpretation is that threats of violence itself in this context could be a tool for coercing women's employment into these sort of more vulnerable types of employment. And it's true. I think in this context, they didn't gain too much bargaining power. In fact, we can see that household decision-making power actually declines in response to the shock. So, I mean, we looked at some heterogeneity, for example, across regions, sort of initial employment status and so on. It's just that we don't have a lot of power, because the domestic violence sample is actually quite small for the type of regression we're trying to run. So we didn't detect, you know, significant heterogeneous effects along that dimension. In terms of fertility and, you know, we just don't think that it's affecting that dimension. You know, that doesn't have to affect. I mean, it's possible that these changes occur, and still, especially if women do not actually gain decision-making power, you know, they may not necessarily also affect their decisions over fertility. In terms of psychological problems, yes, it's exactly our argument that essentially we are trying to shut down that channel, that it's the man's getting upset, and they are, you know, through this psychological upset issue that they abuse. We think it's, instead of this emotional trigger channel, we think it's more the instrumental channel at play. This is the best evidence we can show for that. We did many tests on that psychological problems variable. We didn't find anything so far. Yeah, conditioning on job losses of men. So that's interesting, and we haven't tried that, so we can definitely look into that a little bit more. So thank you. There was a question, so let me see. If tariff changes exogenous, wouldn't it make sense to use a 2SLS to check whether it is statistically exogenous as well? Actually, we did that in an earlier version of the paper, and definitely holds. We took it out in the later version because, you know, we had done it using women's employment. And because the effect could be also working through men's employment, we cannot, at least in the first stage, we can't rule it out. We can try to rule it out later in the alternative channels. So we didn't eventually put that as the final specification for that, because it could be, you know, men's, women's, or just a differential. And I think, you know, at the first stage, because we have effects for both groups, we don't have a clear way to do the 2SLS. Yeah. Okay. Do you mean direct effect of tariff shocks on employment and unemployment? I think he means like direct effect of tariff shocks on, so like the using, I think he means, you know, use district tariff as an instrument for employment, and then using predicted employment, look at the effect on IPV. As I said, we did that for women using women's employment, which is the only variable we observe for DHS. It's the only variable we can use. And actually results were extremely consistent. But later we decided to take it out because I think it makes just a bit more sense to use reduced form estimates in this context. Yeah, for reverse causality indeed. Right. So I think that reverse causality in this context is not a huge concern. If we look at like all of the specifics of how the trade reform was implemented, I worry less that like IPV can affect the district tariff changes. Okay. Was there any other question? Maybe I went too fast, but...
Pardon, Bilge Hocam sorabilir miyim?
Tabii ki, buyurun.
Seyit Cilasun Merkez Bankası'ndan. Bütün identification district level'da ama ben sunumda pek district level'da information görmedim. Yani bu tarifin çok düştüğü bölgeler, employment açısından yapısı nasıl, neler var, kadın erkeğin durumu ne o districtlerde. Belki bu birazcık daha informatif olabilir sonuçları yorumlayabilmek adına. Bir de eğer bu kadar kuvvetli bir etki varsa siz sadece population'a bakıyorsunuz ama ben göç olmamasını pek olası görmüyorum. Eğer bu kadar keskin bir düşüş varsa employment'ta. Dolayısıyla yapı değişmiş olabilir ama bir şekilde popülasyon çok değişmemiş olabilir. Bu da sonuçlarınızı etkiliyor olabilir. Bir de sanırım genel etki tarımda ücretsiz çalışanlardan geliyor kadında, doğru değil mi? Kaçırmadıysam. Dolayısıyla bir ücret etkisi yok aslında ortada, teoriyi hani asıl bizim vurguladığımız ikinci teoriyi destekleyecek. Çünkü artık çalışıyorlar ama ücretsiz çalışıyorlar. Yani erkeği rahatsız eden o kadının daha güçlenmesi gibi bir şey o kadar da söz konusu gibi değil geldi bana sanki, ama siz ne diyorsunuz?
Evet, teşekkür ederim. Evet, bence de yani katılıyorum. Şöyle yani şöyle düşünüyoruz biz, yani bu tarif şoklar genelde daha çok, yani agriculture'da da biraz tabii ki vurdu. Mesela o grafiğe tekrar gidecek olursak hangi sektörler daha çok etkilendi diye bakacak olursak burada sanırım agriculture şuralarda ortalarda bir yerdeydi. Crop, livestock var. Bakayım şurada mıydı ya? Tam hatırlamıyorum nereye düşüyordu. Bu forestry and mining var, fishing var. Yani bunun içinde livestock, forestry, crops, işte şurada crops. Yani çok fazla hani tabii ki tarifikattan etkileniyorlar ama mesela tarifikattan çok ciddi etkilenen sektörler mesela tekstil sektörleri, wearing apparel, beverages, wood products, other textile gibi sektörler. Bunlar da aslında yani tabii Kamboçya yine de kompetitif, bunlar da kompetitif değil anlamında değil ama yani WTO'ya girerken bu tarif katlar nedeniyle aslında sektörlerin hani dağılımına bağlı olarak yani regional seviyede bu sektörlerde çalışan insanlarda bir takım negatif etkiler observe edebiliyoruz. Yani diğer sektörlerde çalışan insanlara göre. Yani bütün etkiler, estimate ettiğimiz etkiler yani relatif etki aslında. Bu yani işte genelde de o yüzden gördüğümüz şey yani manufacturing'den çıkış ve bir agriculture'a doğru geçiş var. Agriculture'da da yani şöyle bir durum var, daha çok absorbe ettiği şeyler böyle informal sektörleri absorbe ediyor. Mesela diyorum önceden tekstil fabrikasında çalışırken şimdi şeydeki kırsal alandaki evine geri dönüyor ve oradaki tarlasını tekrar mesela şey yapmaya başlıyor, çalıştırmaya başlıyor. Evet, yani dediğiniz gibi burada şimdi etki acaba yani kadın bunu kendi iradesiyle mi yapıyor yoksa kocasının zoruyla mı yapıyor? Yani bizim interpretation'ımız birazcık bu noktada hani, o kadar büyük bir artış buluyoruz ki kadının bir kısmının yani bunu yapmasındaki etkinin kocasının zorlamasıyla olduğunu düşünüyoruz. Yani bu da instrumental channel'la bağlanıyor şeklinde düşünebiliriz. Ama doğru yani tamamen işte belki sadece erkekler moralleri bozuldu ve kadınları dövdüler. Yani tamamen rule etmek mümkün değil ama yani psikolojik gösterebildiğimiz değişkenlere göre orada bir etki bulmadık. Ama yani evet dediğiniz gibi district seviyesinde belki manufacture employment tarzı şeyleri gösterebiliriz. O konuda katılıyorum. Teşekkürler. Evet.
Başka soru yok herhalde.
Evet.
Var mı son bir soru alabileceğimiz, yoksa Bilge hocamızı daha fazla yormayalım?
Ay yok, rica ederim. Yani mutlaka eğer başka insanların aklına soru gelirse lütfen e-mail'le atın. Yanıt vermekten gerçekten mutlu olurum.
Çok teşekkür ederiz hocam katıldığınız için.
Çok teşekkürler Güneş Hocam.